Seconds passed. Dre said nothing, just held his brother as tightly as he could. Part of Rafe wanted to smile. The last time Dre had crushed him like this was after he fell 20 feet from a foxtail pine tree springs back. The fall only broke an ankle. Dre's subsequent bear hug had succeeded in breaking 2 ribs. Strangely, the memory had a calming effect on Rafe, and the pain slowly subsided. Rafe's vision blurred sharply, and then reset itself. A feeling of badness grew in him. Swiveling around in his brother's grip, Rafe looked into the direction of the camp. The stench of metal washed over him, as thick as grease smokes from the rendering pits. Dre followed his gaze. "What's the matter?" His voice was tight, strained. "Don't you feel it?" Dre shook his head. The camp was 5 leagues to the north, hidden in the shelter of the flood basin. All Rafe could see was the rapidly darkening sky and the low ridges and rocky flats of the Badlands. Yet he felt something unspeakable, as when nightmares jolted him awake in pitch darkness, or when he thought back to the day when Tem had shut him in the guidehouse with his mother's corpse. He had been 8 at the time, old enough to pay due respect to the dead. The guidehouse was dark and filled with smoke. The hollowed-out basswood where his mother lay smelled of wet earth and rotten things. Sulfur had been rubbed into the carved inner trunk to keep insects and carrion feeders away from the body when it was laid upon the ground. Rafe smelled badness now. He smelled stinking metal, and sulfur, and death. Fighting against Dre's grip, he cried, "We have to go back!" Dre released his grip on Rafe and pulled himself to his feet. He plucked his dogskin gloves from the belt and pulled them on with 2 violent movements. "Why?" Rafe shook his head. The pain and nausea had gone, but something else had come in its place. A tight, shivering fear. The camp. Dre nodded. He took a deep breath and looked set to speak. Then, abruptly, stopped himself. Offering Rafe his hand, he heaved his brother off the ground with a single tug. By the time Rafe had brushed the frost from his buckskins, Dre had collected both bows and was pulling the arrow shafts from the dead tree. As he turned away from the blackstone pine, Rafe noticed the fletchlings in Dre's grip were shaking. This one small sign of his brother's fear worried Rafe more than anything else. Dre was his older brother by 2 years. Dre was afraid of nothing. They had left the camp before dawn, before even the embers on the fire pit had burned cold. No one, except for Tem, knew they had gone. It was their last chance to shoot game before they broke camp and returned to the roundhouse for winter. The previous night, Tem had warned them about going off on their own in the Badlands, though he knew well enough that nothing he said would stop them. "Sons," he said, shaking his large, grizzled beard, "I might as well spend my days picking ticks from the dogs as tell you 2 what you should and shouldn't do. At least come sundown, I'd have a deloused pup to show for my trouble." Tem would glower as he spoke, and the skin above his eyebrows would bunch into knots, yet his eyes always gave him away. Just this morning, as Rafe pulled back the hide fastening on the tent he shared with his father and brother, he noticed a small bundle set upon the warming stone. It was food, hunter's food. Tem had packed 2 whole smoke-curd pattermagan, a brace of hard-boiled eggs, and enough strips of hung mutton to mend an elk-size hole in a tent. All this for his sons to eat on a hunting trip he had expressly forbidden them to take. Rafe smiled. Tem's servants knew his sons well. "Put on your gloves." It was Dre, acting just like an older brother. "And pull up your hood. Temperature's dropping fast." Rafe did what he was told, struggling to put on his gloves with hands that felt big and slow. Dre was right. It was getting colder. Another shiver worked its way up Rafe's spine, making his shoulders jerk awkwardly. "Let's go." Dre's thoroughness was beginning to nettle him. They had to get back to the camp. Now. Something wasn't right. Although Tem warned them constantly about the danger of using up all their energy by running in the cold, Rafe couldn't stop himself. Despite spitting profusely, he couldn't remove the taste of metal from his mouth. The air smelled bad, and the clouds overhead seemed darker, lower, closer. To the south lay a line of bald, featureless hills, and west of them lay the coastal ranges. Tem said that the ranges were the reason why the Want and the Badlands were so dry. He said their peaks milked every last drop of moisture from the passing storms. The 3 hares Rafe had shot earlier thumped up and down his pack as he ran. Rafe hated their warmth against his thigh, was sickened by their fresh kill smell. When the 2 brothers came upon the old Hooper's lake, Rafe tore the pack from his belt and threw it into the center of the dull black water. Old Hooper's wasn't frozen yet. River fed, it would take a full week of frost before the current-driven waters plated. Still, the lake had a greasy look of imminent ice about it. As Rafe's pack sank to the bottom, swirls of vegetable oils and troughs of elk hair bobbed up and down on the surface. Dre swore. Rafe didn't catch what he said, but he imagined the words of waste of fine game in their place. As the brothers ran south, the landscape gradually changed. Trees grew straighter and taller. There were more of them. Beds of lichen were replaced by long grasses, bushes, and sedge. Horse and game tracks formed paths through the frozen foliage. The fat grouse flew up from the undergrowth, all flying feathers and spitting beaks. Rafe barely noticed. Close to the camp perimeter now, they should have been able to see smoke, hear the sound of metal rasping against metal, raised voices, laughter. Dargo Blackhale's foster son, Mace, should have been riding to greet them on his fat-necked cob. Dre swore again, quietly, to himself. Rafe resisted the urge to glance over at his brother's face. He was frightened of what he might see. A powerful horseman, archer, and a hammerman. Dre pulled ahead of Rafe as he charged down the slope to the camp. Rafe pushed himself harder, balling his fist and thrusting out his chin. He didn't want to lose sight of his brother, hated the thought of Dre arriving at the tent circle alone. Fear stretched over Rafe's body like a drying hide, pulling at his skin and gut. They had left 13 men standing by the camp. Dargo Blackhale and his son, Mace, Tem, Chad, and Jory Shank, Malin Clayhorn and his son, Derry, who everyone called Half-Mast. Rafe shook his head softly. 13 men alone on the Badlands plains suddenly seemed unbelievably easy prey. Dune's men, Blood's men, and maimed men were out there. Rafe's stomach clenched. And the Sul were out there too. The dark, weather-stained tents came into view. All was quiet. There were no horses or dogs in sight. The fire pit was a dark, gasping hole in the center of the cleared space. Loose tent flaps ripped in the wind like banners at battle's end. Dre had broken ahead, but now he stopped and waited for Rafe to join him. His breath came hard and fast, and spent air vented from his nose and mouth in great white streams. He did not look round as Rafe approached. "Draw your weapon!" he hissed. Rafe already had, but he scored the blade of his half-sword against the boiled leather scabbard, mimicking the noise of drawing. Dre moved forward when he heard it. They came upon Jory Shank's body first. It was lying in the feed ditch close to the horse's posts. Dre had to turn the body to find the death wound. The portion of Jory's face that had been laying against the earth had taken on a yellow bloom of frozen flesh. The wound was as big as a fist, head deep, made with a greatsword, and for some reason, there was hardly any blood. "Maybe the blood froze as it left him," Dre murmured, settling the body back in place. The words sounded like a prayer. He never got chance to draw his weapon. Look. Rafe was surprised at how calm his voice sounded. Dre nodded. He patted Jory's shoulder and then stood away. "There's horse tracks. See?" Rafe kicked the ground near the first post. He found it easier to concentrate on what he could see here on the camp perimeter than turn his sights toward the tent circle and one shabby, oft-repaired hide and moose felt tent that belonged to Tem's servants. Those shoe marks weren't made by Blackhale horses. Bloodsmen use grooved shoe. So do other clans, even some city men. Yet Rafe had no desire to contradict his brother. Clan Blood's numbers were swelling, and border and cattle raids had become more frequent. Velo Blood had 7 sons, and it was rumored he wanted a separate clanhood for each of them. Mace Blackhale said that Velo Blood killed and ate his own dogs, even when he had elk and bear meat turning on the pit above his fire. Rafe didn't believe the story for a moment. To eat one's own dogs was considered a kind of cannibalism to a clansman, justifiable only in the event of icebound starvation and imminent death. But others, including Dre, did. Mace Blackhale was 3 years older than Dre. When he spoke, Dre took heed. As Dre and Rafe approached the tent circle, their pace slowed. Dead dogs lay in the dirt, saliva frozen around their blunted fangs. Their coats shaggy with ice. Fixed yellow eyes stared from massive gray heads. Glacial winds had set rising hackles in place, giving the dogs' corpses the bunched neck look of a buffalo. As with Jory Shank's body, there was little blood. Rafe smelled stinking, smelted metal everywhere. The air around the camp seemed different, yet he didn't have the words to describe it. It reminded him of the slowly congealing surface of water on Old Hooper's Lake. Something caused the very air to thicken and change. Something with the force of winter itself. "Rafe! Here!" Dre crossed into the tent circle and was kneeling close to the fire pit. Rafe saw the usual line of pots and drying hides suspended on spruce branches over the pit, and the load of timber waiting to be quartered for firewood. He even saw the partially butchered black bear carcass that Dargo Blackhale had brought down yesterday in the sedge meadow to the east. The bearskin, which he had been so proud of, had been set to dry on a nearby rack. Degro had planned to present it as a gift to his wife, Reyna, when the hunt party returned to the roundhouse, but Degro Blackhale, chief of Clan Blackhale, would never return home. Dre knelt over his partially frozen corpse. Degro had taken a massive broadsword stroke from behind. His hands were speckled with blood, and the thick-bladed cleaver he still held in his grip was similarly marked. The blood was neither his nor his attackers. It came from the skin-eviscerated bear carcass laying at his feet. Daegro must have been finishing the butchering when he was jumped from behind. Rafe took a quick, unsteely breath and sank down to his brother's side. Something was blocking his throat. Daegro Blackhail's great bear of a face looked up at him. The clan chief did not look at peace. Fury was frozen in his eyes. Glaciated ice in his beard and mustache framed a mouth pressed hard in anger. Rafe thanked the stone gods that his brother wasn't the kind of man to speak needlessly, and the two sat in silence, shoulders touching, as they paid due respect to the man who had led Clan Blackhail for 29 years and was loved and honored by all in the clan. "He's a fair man," Tem had once said about the clan chief in a rare moment when he was inclined to speak about the matters other than hunting and dogs. "It may seem like small purchase, and you'll find others in the clan willing to heap all manner of praise upon Dargo Blackhail's head, but fairness is the hardest thing for a man to practice day to day. A chief can find himself having to speak up against his sworn brothers and his kin, and that's not easy for anyone to do." It was, Rafe thought, one of the longest speeches he'd ever heard his father make. "It's not right, Rafe." Dre said only that as he raised himself clear of Daegro Blackhail's body, but Rafe knew what he meant. It wasn't right. Mounted men had been here, broadswords and greatswords had been used, clan horses were gone, stolen, dogs were slaughtered, the camp lay in open ground, Mace Blackhail was standing dog watch. A raiding party should not have been able to approach unheeded. Mounted men made noise, especially here in the Badlands, where the bone-hard tundra dealt harshly with anything traveling upon it. And then there was the lack of blood. Rafe pushed back his hood and ran a gloved hand through the tangle of dark hair. Dre was making his way toward Tem's tent. Rafe wanted to call him back, to tell him that they should check the other tents first. The rendering pits, the steam bank, the far perimeter, anywhere except the tent. Dre, as if sensing some small portion of his younger brother's thoughts, turned. He made a small beckoning gesture with his hand and then waited. Two bright points of pain prickled directly behind Rafe's eyes. Dre always waited. Together, the sons of Tem's servants entered their father's tent. The body was just a few paces short of the entrance. Tem looked as if he had been on the way out when the broadsword cracked his sternum and clavicle, sending splinters of bone into the windpipe, lungs, and heart. He had fallen with his half-sword in his hand, but, as with Jory's shank, the weapon was unbloodied. "Broadsword again," Dre said, his voice high, then rough as he sought to control it. "Blood favors them." Rafe didn't acknowledge the words. It took all he had just to stand and look upon his father's body. Suddenly, there was too much hollow space in his chest. Tem didn't seem as stiff as the others, and Rafe stripped off his right glove and bent to touch what was visible of his father's cheek. Cold, dead flesh, not frozen, but utterly cold, absent. Pulling back as if he had touched something scorching hot rather than just plain cold, Rafe rubbed his hands on his buckskins, wiping off whatever he imagined to be upon it. Tem was gone. Gone. Without waiting for Dre, Rafe pushed aside the tent flap and struck out into the rapidly darkening camp. His heart was beating in wild, irregular beats, and taking action seemed the only way to stop it. When Dre found him a quarter later, Rafe's right arm was stripped to the shoulder, and blood from 3 separate cuts was pouring along his forearm and down his wrist. Dre understood immediately. Tearing at his own sleeve, he joined his brother as he went among the slain men. All had died without blood on their weapons. To a clansman, there was no honor in dying with a clean blade, so Rafe was taking up their weapons one by one, drawing their blades across his skin, and spilling his own blood as a substitute. It was the one thing the two brothers could give to their clan. When they returned home to the roundhouse and someone asked, as someone always did, if the men had died fighting, Rafe and Dre could now reply, their weapons ran with blood. To a clansman, those words mattered dear, so the two brothers moved around the camp, discovering bodies in and out of tents, some with pale icicles of urine frozen in their legs, others with hair set in spiky mats where they had been caught bathing, a few with frozen wads of black curd still in their mouths, and one man, Meth Ganlow, with his beefy arms fixed around his favorite dog, protecting the wolfling even in death. A single sword strike had killed both man and beast. It was only later, when moonlight formed silver pools in the hard earth, and Tem's body was lying beside the fire pit, close to the others, but set apart, that Rafe suddenly stopped in his tracks. "We never found Mace Blackhail," he said.